You're fired. A hand in your apron. The warm glow of Jackson's diner flickered against the night as Emily Carter wiped down the counter. It had been another long shift, nothing glamorous but enough to keep the bills paid. Through the large window, the neon 50% off for veterans sign buzzed softly, casting a faint red tint on the damp sidewalk outside. The place wasn't much, but it had its charm: cracked red booze, the smell of fresh coffee, and a jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked in years. The doorbell chimed. Emily looked up just as an elderly woman stepped inside. She moved carefully, as though carrying an unseen weight. Her cardigan was worn, her shoes scuffed, and in her hands she clutched a neatly folded military cap. Emily's heart clenched. There was something about the way the woman held that cap, like it was the most precious thing she had left. Smiling, Emily stepped forward. "Welcome to Jackson's, just you tonight." The woman hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, dear, just me." Her voice was soft but tired. Emily led her to a quiet booth near the window. The woman sat down carefully, setting the cap on the table like it belonged to someone else, someone who should have been sitting there with her. Emily swallowed a lump in her throat and grabbed a coffee pot. A few minutes later she returned, pouring a warm cup and setting it in front of the woman. "Do you know what you'd like?" The woman glanced at the menu, then just as quickly, she looked away, her fingers curled around the cap, squeezing the fabric like she was trying to draw strength from it. "I don't have enough," she murmured, barely above a whisper. Emily felt something tighten in her chest. She had seen this before, people too proud to ask for help, even when they needed it the most. Without hesitation, Emily smiled. "It's on me." The woman's head snapped up, her eyes wide, filled with something between surprise and shame. "I can't let you do that," she whispered, shaking her head. Emily knelt slightly, placing a gentle hand over hers. "It's just dinner," she said softly. Then she glanced at the cap on the table. "And it looks like you've earned it." The woman's lip trembled. She swallowed hard, blinking rapidly, as if trying to push back emotions she didn't want to show. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. Emily didn't wait for more. She simply smiled, patted the woman's hand gently, then stood up and walked to the register. She reached into her own pocket, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, and rang up the order herself. She had no idea that one small act of kindness was about to change everything. The hum of the diner felt distant as Emily Carter rang up the meal, slipping a crumpled $20 bill from her own pocket into the register. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give the elderly woman a warm meal and a little dignity. She had just set the plate in front of the woman when a sharp voice cut through the quiet. "Emily," a word. Her stomach twisted. She knew that tone. Turning slowly, she saw Carl Benson, the diner's manager, standing in the doorway of his office. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable, but the tightness in his jaw told her everything she needed to know. Emily forced herself to stay calm. "Yes, Carl." Carl walked toward the counter, glancing at the plate of food in front of the elderly woman. "Did she pay for that meal?" Emily swallowed. "No." Carl exhaled sharply. "And who did?" Emily met his gaze. "I did." Carl's expression darkened. "You used your own money?" Emily nodded. "Yes." Carl scoffed. "And you thought that was okay?" Emily clenched her fists at her sides. "She's a veteran's wife, Carl. She just wanted a warm meal." Carl let out a dry laugh. "And that's not your problem." The woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat, lowering her gaze. Emily felt anger rise in her chest. "So that's what we do now? We throw out veterans' families because they're struggling." Carl's lips pressed into a thin line. "You break the rules, you pay the price," he said coldly. "That's how it works." Then he turned to the woman. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The entire diner went silent. The elderly woman's hands trembled as she reached for her military cap, her face flushed with embarrassment. Emily felt something snap inside her. She had two choices: stay silent and keep her job, or stand up for what was right. She made her choice. "No." The single word hung in the air. Carl's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me." Emily straightened her shoulders. "She's not going anywhere." Carl took a step closer, towering over her. "This is my restaurant. If I say she leaves, she leaves." Emily didn't back down. If you're kicking someone out, it better be me first. A tense silence stretched between them. Carl's nostrils flared, then he made his decision. You're fired. Emily's breath caught. She had known it was coming, but hearing the words still hit like a punch to the gut. The elderly woman gasped, "Oh dear, no, I didn't mean to cause." Emily turned to her and managed a small reassuring smile. "Don't apologize," she said softly. "You didn't do anything wrong." With slow, deliberate movements, she reached behind her neck, untied her apron, and folded it neatly before placing it on the counter. Her hands were steady, her heart was not. Carl smirked. "Doors that way." Emily lifted her chin. "I know where it is." She turned toward the exit, every step feeling heavier than the last. Just as she reached for the door, the bell above it jingled. The door swung open, and a group of soldiers walked in. Emily stopped in her tracks. 5 men in uniform stepped inside. They moved with a quiet confidence, their presence immediately commanding attention. Customers turned in their seats, whispers rippling through the diner. Carl's smug expression faded. The lead soldier, a tall man with sharp eyes and a firm stance, surveyed the room before his gaze locked onto Emily. "Who's Emily Carter?" he asked. Emily blinked. I am." The soldier nodded. "We need to talk." Carl cleared his throat. Gentlemen, this isn't a military facility. If you're looking for food, we can." The soldier ignored him completely. His gaze remained on Emily. "We heard what happened here tonight." Emily's heart pounded. "How did you, Then he turned to the elderly woman, still sitting in the booth. "Ma'am, is it true that you are the wife of Lieutenant Colonel Mark Holloway?" The woman gasped, her lips parted, but for a moment no words came out. Finally she nodded slowly. Yes, I am." The soldiers immediately straightened their postures. One of them, a younger man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. "I served under your husband, ma'am," he said quietly. "He saved my life." A soft cry escaped her lips. She brought a trembling hand to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Emily felt her own throat tighten. The lead soldier turned back to Emily. "All what you did tonight," he said. "It didn't go unnoticed." Emily's mind spun. "Oh, I just paid for a meal," she murmured. The soldier shook his head. "No, you did more than that. You showed respect when no one else did." His gaze flickered to Carl. Carl shifted uncomfortably. The soldier continued, "And we don't take that lightly." Emily didn't know what to say. Her hands were still clenched at her sides, adrenaline still rushing through her veins. Carl scoffed, trying to regain control of the situation. "Well, I'm sure this is a touching moment," he said, "but she's no longer an employee here. She's free to leave." The soldier smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. "She's leaving," he said. "With us." Emily stared. "With you?" she echoed. The soldier nodded. "There's someone who wants to meet you." Emily's stomach flipped. Carl looked between them, eyes darting nervously. "Who?" Emily asked. The soldier's lips curled into a knowing smile. "You'll see." Emily Carter stood motionless, trying to process what had just happened. The soldier's words echoed in her mind. "There's someone who wants to meet you." She swallowed hard. Who? And why did she feel like she had just stepped into something far bigger than herself? Carl, her now former manager, let out a dry chuckle, arms folded across his chest. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed. "She's a waitress, not some war hero." And the lead soldier's gaze snapped toward him, and Carl instinctively took a step back. "No," the soldier said evenly, "but she understands honor, and that's more than I can say for some people." Carl opened his mouth, as if to argue, then closed it, realizing there was nothing he could say. Emily felt a strange mix of emotions, disbelief, uncertainty, and something else she couldn't quite name. She had spent the past few minutes accepting that she had just lost her job, yet now standing in front of these soldiers, that seemed like the least important thing in the world. The lead soldier motioned toward the door. "Come with us." Emily hesitated, looking back at the elderly woman, still seated in the booth. Her eyes were red, her hands shaking slightly, but there was something in them now, something lighter, freer. Emily gave her a small smile. "I'll nod," before turning back to the soldiers. She took a deep breath, then she followed them out the door. The air outside was crisp, and the streetlights cast long shadows along the pavement. A military vehicle sat parked at the curb, its engine humming softly. "Where are we going?" Emily finally asked as the soldier opened the door for her. "You'll see soon enough," he replied. She climbed in, nerves buzzing through her. The door shut behind her, and the vehicle pulled away from the diner. Silence filled the cabin as they drove through the city. Emily glanced out the window, her mind racing. What could possibly be so important that a group of soldiers had come looking for her? After what felt like an eternity, the vehicle finally slowed, turning down a quiet road lined with tall iron fences. At the end of the street stood a large, well-lit building with an American flag swaying gently in the night breeze. A military base. Emily's stomach twisted. The vehicle rolled to a stop, and the door opened. The lead soldier motioned for her to step out. She did, her shoes crunching softly against the gravel. Right this way, they walked toward the building, past guards who nodded respectfully at the men leading her. Emily felt like she had stepped into a world completely separate from her own. The lead soldier opened a side door and gestured for her to enter. As soon as she stepped inside, her breath caught in her throat. Sitting at a large oak desk in full uniform was a high-ranking officer. His posture was straight, his expression unreadable. But what caught Emily's attention wasn't his uniform or the rows of medals pinned to his chest. It was the look in his eyes, one of deep, unwavering gratitude. He stood as she entered, his gaze locked onto hers. "You must be Emily Carter," he said, his voice steady but warm. Emily nodded. "Yes, sir." The officer motioned toward the chair in front of his desk. "Please, have a seat." Emily hesitated before sitting down, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. The officer leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the desk. "I heard what happened tonight," he said. Emily swallowed. I didn't think it was anything special. It was just a meal." The officer's lips pressed together. "Not to us." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small framed photograph. He set it on the desk and turned it toward her. Emily's breath hitched. It was a photo of a younger version of the elderly woman from the diner, standing beside a man in uniform. He looked strong, proud, his arm wrapped tightly around his wife. The officer exhaled. "Lieutenant Colonel Mark Holloway was one of the best men I ever served with. He saved lives on the battlefield. He sacrificed everything for his country." Emily felt her throat tighten. The officer met her gaze again. His wife has spent the past few years struggling, trying to make ends meet. Tonight, for the first time in a long time, someone reminded her that her husband's sacrifice still mattered, that she still mattered. "Emily," I blinked rapidly, fighting back the sting of tears. "You didn't just pay for a meal," the officer continued. "You gave her back a piece of dignity, and that is something we don't forget." For the first time since losing her job, Emily felt something other than anger and uncertainty. She felt pride. The officer stood and reached into a small box on his desk. When he turned back, he held a pin, a small but significant military insignia. He stepped around the desk and gently placed it in Emily's hand. "Hold. This is a token of our appreciation," he said. "It's not much, but it's our way of saying thank you." Emily looked down at the insignia resting in her palm. She had never served in the military. She had never stepped onto a battlefield. But in that moment, she felt like she had done something that mattered. "Hold." She looked back up at the officer. "Hold." "Thank you, sir," she whispered. The officer gave her a firm nod. "There's one more thing," he said. "We run a veterans outreach program, and we need people who care, people like you." Emily's eyes widened. "You want me to work with you?" The officer smiled. "If you're interested, yes." Emily let out a shaky breath. Just a few hours ago, she had lost her job. Now she was being offered something much more meaningful. She didn't hesitate. "I'd be honored." The officer extended his hand, and Emily shook it firmly. And with that, her life changed forever. Carl Benson stood frozen in the middle of Jackson's diner, his face pale, his breath short. Applause erupted around him. It started with just a few claps, a woman near the counter, a man by the window, and then within seconds the entire diner was on its feet, cheering. Customers who had been quietly finishing their meals just moments ago were now standing, clapping, nodding at Emily Carter in admiration. "She did the right thing," a woman called out. "This is what respect looks like." another added. Carl's jaw tightened as he scanned the room, searching for at least one person who might agree with him, someone who might back him up, but he found none. And then his phone rang. The sharp vibration in his pocket made him flinch. He fumbled for it, his hands suddenly clammy. When he saw the name on the caller ID, his stomach twisted, the owner of Jackson's Diner. Carl hesitated for only a second before answering. Hello? The voice on the other end was sharp, clipped and angry. I just saw the video, the man snapped. Carl felt his entire body tense. I can explain, he stammered. You fired her. The owner's voice was ice cold. Carl swallowed. Sir, I can. What the hell were you thinking? The owner barked. You have any idea how fast this is spreading? Carl's heart pounded in his chest. Spreading? His fingers shook as he pulled the phone away from his ear, tapping frantically at the screen. And then he saw it. A video of the entire incident filmed by a customer sitting near the window had been uploaded. It already had hundreds of thousands of views. Carl's stomach dropped. The caption read, Waitress stands up for Taryn's widow gets fired on the spot. His eyes darted down to the comment section. The words blurred together in a mix of outrage and disgust. This is disgusting. Who owns this place? Never eating here again. She deserves a promotion, not to be fired. Somebody find this girl and give her a job ASAP. Carl's grip tightened on the phone, and then his boss spoke again, his voice low and full of warning. If you don't fix this right now, I will make sure you are the one looking for a job tomorrow. The line went dead. Carl lowered the phone slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. His gaze flickered up to Emily, who was still standing near the entrance, her expression unreadable. The applause was finally dying down, but every single person in that diner was still watching him. Carl licked his lips, trying to gather himself, trying to salvage what was left. He took a breath and stepped forward. Emily, he started, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. I think we might have been a little hasty. Emily didn't respond. She just tilted her head slightly, watching him. Carl let out an awkward chuckle. I mean, we can work something out. Maybe reconsider this. Emily held up a hand. Stop, she said. Carl blinked. What? She took a deep breath, and for the first time in years she felt something she hadn't felt in this place before. Power. I don't need this job, she said, her voice calm but firm. I never did. Carl's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Emily shook her head. You didn't fire me because I did something wrong. You fired me because you were too much of a coward to do the right thing. Carl's face flushed red, but he had no response. Emily took a step back, letting her final words settle in the air. Then, without looking back, she walked out the door, and that's when she heard the deep rumbling engine. Emily froze. A large military vehicle had just pulled up in front of the diner. The door swung open, and a soldier stepped out, the same one who had come into the diner earlier. But he wasn't alone. Another vehicle pulled in behind him, then another, a convoy. The hairs on the back of Emily's neck stood on end. The soldier walked toward her with a small, knowing smile. Miss Carter, he said, stopping a few feet away. Emily swallowed. Yeah. The soldier studied her for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her. Emily hesitated before taking it. When she unfolded the page, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just any piece of paper. It was a job offer. I told you, Bowie, the soldier said, his voice steady. There's someone who wants to meet you. Emily's fingers tightened around the letter. She looked back up at him, her mind spinning. What kind of job? She asked cautiously. The soldier's smile widened just slightly. The kind where you can actually make a difference, he said. Emily stared at him. Just a few hours ago she had thought losing her job was the worst thing that could happen. Now as she looked, Emily stared at the military insignia printed on the letterhead. She realized it might have been the best moment of her life. The soldier took a step back, motioning toward the waiting vehicle. Well, he asked, are you coming? Emily let out a slow breath, then she nodded. With that, she climbed into the vehicle, her old life behind her, her new one just beginning. Emily Carter sat in the back of the military vehicle, staring down at the job offer in her hands. Her fingers traced over the official letterhead. the military insignia, embossed at the top. She still couldn't believe what was happening. Hours ago she had been a waitress. Now she was being offered something far bigger than herself. She lifted her gaze to the soldier sitting across from her. "A different job?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. The soldier nodded. "We're expanding a veteran support program," he explained. "We need people who actually care, people like you." Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. All her life she had worked just to get by, a paycheck, a routine, a way to survive. But this was a chance to actually make a difference. Her mind flashed back to the elderly woman in the diner, the way she had gripped that faded military cap, like it was the last piece of her husband she had left. Emily had seen the way the world could be cruel and indifferent to those who had sacrificed the most. And now she had a chance to do something about it. She exhaled slowly. "What would I be doing?" The soldier smiled slightly, sensing her growing interest. "Helping families of veterans," he said. "Making sure they don't fall through the cracks. We need people who can connect with them. You already have that instinct." Emily stared at him. She thought about her old job, about how Carl had treated that woman, like she was invisible, like she didn't matter. She thought about how many others out there were struggling the same way. This was her chance to change that. She met the soldier's gaze and nodded. "I'm in." The soldier's smile widened. "Good choice," he said. The vehicle rumbled forward, carrying her toward a new future. The next morning, Emily's name was everywhere. Her phone buzzed non-stop with calls and messages. Friends, family, even people she hadn't spoken to in years, were reaching out, congratulating her, thanking her. She didn't fully understand why, until she turned on the TV. Her face was on the screen. A national news anchor was talking about her. The story of a young waitress who stood up for a veteran's widow and was fired for it had captured hearts across the country. What started as a small moment of kindness had now turned into a movement, sparking conversations about how we treat our nation's heroes and their families. Emily's stomach flipped. She watched in stunned silence as the footage from the diner played on the screen. The confrontation with Carl, the moment she took off her apron, the soldier walking in. Then came clips of people reacting online. Social media posts flooded the screen. "Humanity should look like this. We need more people like Emily in the world. Veterans and their families deserve better." Emily's chest tightened with emotion. She had just wanted to do the right thing. She had never expected this. The camera cut back to the anchor. "In response to the overwhelming support, several organizations have reached out to offer Emily new opportunities, including a veterans advocacy program, where she will be working directly with military families in need." Emily blinked. It was real. This was really happening. Her phone buzzed again. She looked down. It was a message from the elderly woman she had helped. "Thank you, Emily. I thought the world had forgotten about us, but because of you, I know that's not true." Emily pressed her hand against her mouth, overwhelmed. She had lost a job, but she had found something much more important, a purpose, a chance to stand for those who had stood for their country. And it had all started with one simple act of kindness. She let out a slow breath and smiled. Sometimes doing what's right doesn't just change someone else's life, it changes yours too. In today's world, kindness often feels like a rare commodity. People are too busy, too distracted, or too afraid to stand up when they see something wrong. But Emily's story reminds us that one small act of compassion can change everything. She didn't think twice before helping a veteran's wife. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because it was the right thing to do. And yet that simple act of kindness had a ripple effect, turning into something far greater than she ever imagined. How many times have we seen someone in need and walked away thinking, "It's not my problem"? Maybe it was a struggling veteran at the grocery store, an elderly neighbor needing help, or a single mother counting change at the checkout. It's easy to look away, but what if we didn't? What if instead we chose to step in, to defend, to help, even when no one is watching? Here's the truth. The world doesn't change through grand gestures. It changes through small everyday acts of decency. Have you ever witnessed an act of kindness that restored your faith in humanity? Share your story in the comments. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, subscribe to Zoya Creation, where real heroes remind us that integrity still matters, because some stories don't just change lives, they change hearts.